Chapter 2. Growth of Nationalism. Introduction. One of the most distinguishing features of the second half of the 19th century was the birth of national awakening in India. It originated from the concepts of nationalism and right of self-determination initiated by the French Revolution, the socio-religious reform movements in India, as an offshoot of modernization introduced by the British in India, and as a reaction of the Indians to the British colonial policies. The political awareness generated by these trends gave birth to various political associations. This trend culminated in the establishment of the Indian National Congress in 1885, which marked the formal beginning of the organized national movement in India. In this chapter, we shall learn about factors leading to the growth of nationalism, like economic exploitation, repressive colonial policies, socio-religious reform, contribution of Raja Rammohan Roy and Jyotiba Phule, and role of the press. Foundation of the Indian National Congress, the Indian National Association, Surendranath Banerjee, and the East India Association, Dadabhai Nauroji, as precursors. Immediate objectives of the Indian National Congress, the first two sessions and their presidents. Factors promoting growth of nationalism. Nationalism refers to the feeling of oneness and common consciousness that emerges when people living in a common territory share the same historical, political, and cultural background, have the same language, cultural values, and consider themselves as one nation. Though India had a long history going back to many centuries, it was never a one nation and comprised many kingdoms. There were times when vast portions of the Indian subcontinent came under the rule of one empire. But the loyalty of the people was towards a particular king or kingdom. The modern feeling of nationalism was lacking among them. It emerged during the British rule, mainly as a reaction to the British rule and the clash of interests of the Indian people with those of the British. As we have read in the previous chapter, Indians resisted the British rule from its very beginning. But this resistance was localized and scattered. It was undertaken by the deposed chieftains, their descendants and relations, zamindars, ex-soldiers, and officials of the Indian states. The culmination of traditional opposition to British rule came with the First War of Independence. Although it failed to achieve its objectives, it inspired the Indians to resist the foreign power and make a determined struggle for the country's freedom. Thus, the very nature of the foreign rule resulted in nationalistic sentiments rising among the Indians and produced conditions conducive for the rise and growth of a powerful national movement. The second half of the 19th century witnessed the emergence of national political consciousness and strong feeling of nationalism. There were many factors which contributed to the growth of nationalism in India. These included the following. 1. Economic exploitation. There were many factors that aroused opposition to British rule. Economic exploitation was the most important among them. The Indians realized that the general aim of the British policies in India was to promote their own interests at the cost of welfare of Indians. The economic discontent of different sections of society was as follows. First, the peasants. They were the main victims of British colonial policies. The government took away a large part of their produce in the form of land revenue and other taxes. These exorbitant taxes led the peasants into the clutches of landlords and money lenders.
अगर आप अपने सिलेबस के सारे चैप्टर्स इस फॉर्मेट में देखना चाहते हैं तो हमें डिस्क्रिप्शन में दिए गए नंबर पर कॉल करें.
Second, the artisans and craftsmen. The British economic policies were against the interests of Indian trade and industry. The English East India Company used its political power to destroy Indian handicrafts and industry. India became source of raw materials for the industries of Britain and a market for its finished products. This policy crippled the artisans and the craftsmen as they were devoid of their sources of livelihood. Third, the working class. The growth of modern industries led to the birth of a new social class in India, the working class. They were exploited by the factory owners, who were generally Englishmen. Although they formed a small section of the population, they represented a new social outlook. Their outlook and interests were very broad, covering whole of India, though their factories were located in cities. All these factors made their political thinking far more significant than their numerical strength. Fourth, the educated Indians. The only employment available to the educated Indians was government service, in which competition was high and chances of promotions were bleak. They had hoped that British capitalism would help to develop India's productive forces as it had done for Britain. Instead, they found that British policies were keeping India economically backward. Thus, all sections of the society felt that their economic salvation lay in freeing themselves from the British rule. To achieve this objective, the Indian people had to come together on a national platform. In the process, the spirit of nationalism received a powerful stimulus. 2. Repressive colonial policies. The nature of the British colonial rule over India helped the growth of national sentiment among the Indians. The British had conquered India to promote their own interests and therefore followed such repressive policies so as to make India subservient to the needs of Britain. These policies became the major barrier to India's economic, social, cultural, intellectual and political development. Some of these repressive policies, especially those followed by Lord Lytton, Viceroy of India from 1876 to 1880, acted as a catalyst for the growth of nationalist movement in India. These included the following policies.
अगर आप अपने सिलेबस के सारे चैप्टर्स इस फॉर्मेट में देखना चाहते हैं तो हमें डिस्क्रिप्शन में दिए गए नंबर पर कॉल करें.
First, Lord Lytton organized a grand Delhi Darbar in 1877 to proclaim Queen Victoria as the Empress of India. Lakhs of rupees were spent on the event, but nothing was done for Indians who were in the grip of a famine. Second, Lord Lytton introduced the Vernacular Press Act in 1878 and Indian Arms Act 1878. The Vernacular Press Act forbade vernacular papers to publish any material that might excite feelings of dissatisfaction against the British government. This act was not applicable to English newspapers. In 1882, this act was repealed by Lord Ripon. The Indian Arms Act of 1878 made it a criminal offence for Indians to carry arms without license. This act was not applicable to the British. Third, the maximum age limit for the Indian Civil Service examination was reduced from 21 to 19 years, thus making it difficult for the Indians to compete for it. Fourth, the import duties on British textiles was removed. it proved harmful for the Indian industry. Fifth, Sir C.P. Ilbert, the law member of the Viceroy's Council, prepared a bill popularly known as the Ilbert Bill in 1883. The bill, which was introduced by the Viceroy, Lord Ripon, sought to abolish judicial disqualification based on race distinctions. This was resented by the British, and they started a defence association to defend their special privileges. This reaction provoked counter-agitation by educated Indians. The government ultimately withdrew the bill and enacted a more moderate measure which vested the power of trying Europeans to a session judge and a district magistrate who might be an Indian. This bill made it clear to the Indians that justice and fair play could not be expected where the interests of the European community were involved. So, these repressive policies of the British provided a stimulus to political agitation and quickened the pace of Indian nationalism. 3. Socio-Religious reform movements. The socio-religious reform movements of the 19th century were great pioneers of Indian nationalism. The impact of Western education, which led to a rational, humanitarian and scientific approach to life, made the educated Indians realize the need to reform their religion and society. They felt that the path to progress lay in the acceptance of the best of the East and the West. The result was the birth of socio-religious reform movements touching almost every segment of Indian society. In the social sphere, these movements worked for the abolition of caste system, child marriage, dowry system, parda system, sati, and infanticide. They launched a crusade against social and legal inequalities. In the religious sphere, these reform movements combated religious superstitions, attacked idolatry, polytheism, and hereditary priesthood. These movements fought for individual liberty and social equality. Prominent reform movements were Brahmo Samaj, founded by Raja Rammohan Roy, Arya Samaj, founded by Swami Dayanand Saraswati, Ramakrishna Mission, founded by Swami Vivekananda, and Satya Shodhak Samaj, founded by Jyotiba Phule.
अगर आप अपने सिलेबस के सारे चैप्टर्स इस फॉर्मेट में देखना चाहते हैं तो हमें डिस्क्रिप्शन में दिए गए नंबर पर कॉल करें। ऐसे ही और एजुकेशनल वीडियोस देखने के लिए हमारे चैनल होम रिवाइज को सब्सक्राइब करें।